taxes would not have been pleasant. Force would have been needed. At the same time, all the accumulating wealth would be a temptation to robbers and ultimately to rival cities. So walls were built, and some men given the job of full-time protectors. A warrior class emerged. Nothing, sad to say, has advanced technical progress faster than war. The invention of bronze, replacing flint or bone as the cutting-edge technology, gave the Sumerians a brief advantage. Then came chariots, first slow and four-wheeled, later two-wheeled. They may have developed first for that next novelty, leisure time, which the upper classes used for hunting. Priests of religion, large-scale building projects, writing, taxes, soldiers, kings, the ability to make war, all arrive in human history alongside one another based on the first cities, which are really the first concentrations of stored wealth, themselves based on riverside farming cultures that needed to work together to tame nature. This is the shift that is more powerful than the old ties of clan, kin, and lineage, and marks the next important moment in human development after farming itself. Rivalry between cities and peoples will start to accelerate change, unless and until full-scale war brings catastrophe, which from time to time it does. The rise of trained bureaucrats with their cuneiform writing implements permits different people with different languages to communicate. Sumerian becomes the lingua franca for Mesopotamia, and scribes become bilingual. A momentum is underway, which may be lost here or there, but which has never stopped since. The first cities also nurtured a flowering of abstract thought. The ruling class of kings and priests had time to speculate, not least about the mysterious world of winking lights and movements overhead that had also obsessed the builders of Stonehenge. So it is no surprise that Mesopotamia gave us mathematics, both the simple sums to tally trade and taxes, and the more complicated ones used to try to track the stars. Looking up, the Sumerians and Babylonians wondered about this nightly message, with its shapes and regular patterns. If the gods were able to send messages back to them, were these the divine writing? Was there a pattern which could then be imposed on the hazier rhythms of human life? Reading the stars required measurement of angles. The Sumerians plotted the movements of the 5 planets they could see, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and named a day after each. They then named one day after the moon, and another after the sun, giving them a 7-day week. 7 was regarded as a perfect number, and the Sumerian week is, of course, our week, its days still named in the Sumerian fashion, though with Roman or Old English words. Saturn becomes Saturday, Sol, the sun in Latin, becomes Sunday, Luna, the moon, becomes Lundi in French, or our Monday, Moon Day. Mars is Mardi, though in English, thanks to a Norse god, Tuesday. Similarly, Wednesday is Wodin's day, but Wodin was the god associated with the planet Mercury. Jupiter is Jeudi, or in English, Thursday, Thor being the northern god associated with Jupiter. Venus is Vendredi, or Friday. The Sumerians also developed a counting system based on the number 60, which is divisible by 11 other numbers, and so particularly handy for Bronze Age accountancy. From this, we get our 60-second minutes, 60-minute hours, 360-day years, and 360-degree circles. By Babylonian times, scribes had to be fast and accurate. One examination tablet from their city of Nippur asks, "Do you know multiplication, reciprocals, coefficients, balancing of accounts, administrative accounting, how to make all kinds of pay allotments, divide property, and delimit shares of fields?" All of this is remarkable enough, but the first cities also bring a flowering of art and design. with gorgeously made alabaster carvings and mosaics, and graceful as well as useful stamp seals for parcels of goods from Uruk, plus inlaid gaming boards, musical instruments, and delicate gold jewellery from Ur, even before we get to the amazing carved reliefs of the Assyrians and Babylonians. Today, thanks to the habits of 19th-century archaeologists, the loveliest of these things can be found in Berlin and, to a lesser extent, London, not in Iraq. Each Mesopotamian city had its own gods, culture, and reputation. Uruk was famous not only for its huge ziggurat and sky god, but for its sexy female deity, Inanna, who was associated with all kinds of fertility, and whose rites shocked one Babylonian writer. Uruk, city of prostitutes, courtesans, and call-girls, the party boys and festival people who changed masculinity to femininity. And it took a lot to shock a Babylonian. So, these first cities are among the most important sites in the human story. Successive floods have reduced many of them to gritty stumps and obliterated others. Neglect, war, and the lack of interest of later cultures, followed by aggressive treasure-hunting Victorian archaeology, has meant that while some of their greatest carvings and other artefacts are in European museums, the sites themselves are often dusty disappointments. This is tragic, since the achievements of the Sumerians, Akkadians, and early Babylonians were huge, and in some ways much more impressive than those of the better-known Egyptians. Their city culture was bureaucratic and clearly in some ways oppressive, weighing heavily on farmers, requiring payment in return for the canals and wells that kept their fields so fertile. It allowed the emergence of kings with enough muscle to go to war against one another and to carve out the first empires, along with the misery that early mass killers such as Sargon of Akkad brought to the land. But these first cities were also places of beauty, intellectual advance, wonder, and, quite clearly, a great deal of not very innocent fun. Da Yu to you. You might imagine that the earliest named Chinese hero was a warrior ruler like Gilgamesh, or some bearded sage, but you would be wrong. He is a public servant, an engineer, and only latterly a king. Da Yu, or the Great Yu, a figure who stands just on the wrong side of the line between myth and history, was the man who tamed the Yellow River, that life-giving but capricious core of early Chinese culture. Da Yu's father, so the story goes, was a man called Gun, who had been given the job by the local ruler of dealing with devastating river floods. Most early cultures, particularly across Asia and Europe, have flood stories, suggesting that there was a time of flooding so bad that it remained in the consciousness of peoples for millennia. In China's case, Gun tried to cope by building dikes, presumably using the same rammed earth technique found in early Chinese towns. But more floods came and simply washed the earth walls away. The king who had commissioned Gun punished him by cutting him into many pieces. Gun's son, the presumably rather anxious Da Yu, then took on the job in his scattered father's place. Da Yu, it is said, worked ferociously hard, but he did not build dikes. First, he travelled up and down the river talking to the local tribes and persuading people that they would have to work together and accept central authority if the problem was to be coped with. The parallels with the rise of the Mesopotamian cities are obvious. Next, he had channels dug to send the water to other rivers and irrigation systems built to spread it across the farmland. Instead of confronting his enemy head-on, Da Yu confused the river by dividing it. For 13 years he worked fanatically, reducing his hands and feet to calloused pads. It is said that during that time he passed by his home on 3 occasions. The first time he heard his wife in labour, but did not stop or go in. The second time his son was old enough to call out his name. He did not stop, because the floods were in full spate. The third time his son was over 10 years old. Again, Da Yu ignored him and kept working. Today, he would be pursued by the Child Support Agency and condemned by newspaper columnists. Things were different then. The king was so impressed by his diligence and dedication that he passed the throne to him. Da Yu reigned for 45 years, and then, by passing the throne to his son, founded the Xia dynasty. Later, copious amounts of nonsense were glued onto the story, ranging from Da Yu cutting through a mountain with a magic battle-axe to his having engaged the services of a yellow dragon and a black turtle to help him. But the first key point is that, according to the earliest Chinese historians, the first Chinese dynasty began with attempts to control flooding. And that is at the very least a good guess on their part. About 4,000 years ago, there seems to have been a collapse in Chinese settlements, at just the time when the same was happening in the Middle East and Egypt. Going back to those flood stories, Noah and the rest, the historian Ian Morris asks, could climate change have brought on an old-world crisis? The same annals that describe Da Yu speak of rain continuing for 9 years, causing catastrophic flooding. But there is no Noah, no Ark. China starts with a public servant hero, an organizer working for the state. There is something here that feels very un-Western. From almost the beginning, Chinese culture looks as well as feels distinctively Chinese. Put a reasonably educated person from anywhere in the world in front of certain late Neolithic pottery, or very early bronze vessels, or show them the first symbols being used for writing, and even if they have never seen such things before, they will probably instantly declare Chinese. The origins of the Chinese are shrouded in archaeological uncertainty and political argument. Many Chinese insist they did not emerge, like the rest of the world's human population, out of Africa, but evolved separately from an earlier ape migration, that of Homo erectus, in China. Thus, they are biologically distinct from foreigners, satisfying to the Chinese world view, even if the scientific consensus outside China is that they are wrong. Overall, human development in China followed along similar lines to that of the Fertile Crescent, but around 2,000 years later. Though in some things, like pottery, it was more advanced. The breakthroughs in the taming of plants and animals, the appearance of villages, graves suggesting ancestor worship, are all relatively similar. Yet by the time myth first begins to edge into history, Chinese objects are already different-looking. Today's archaeologists tend to emphasize the variation and complexity of ancient China. Many cultures, many different kinds of pottery and building, scattered over a wide area. Recent finds have upended the old idea of there being one central Chinese civilization in the north, which spread to the rest and has carried on more or less intact. But what is very different from the European experience is the emotional grip of a continuity with earliest times on the Chinese imagination. For instance, the culture known as Longshan lasted for around 1,000 years, from roughly 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, about the same time as the various phases of the Neolithic cultures of Britain. But while Europeans have lost any record or memory of the Stonehenge people, Chinese history claims a link with the first kings and cultures. There were 5 mythical emperors, primordial godly rulers, who gave mankind the key inventions of civilization, such as cooking, farming, fire, medicine, marriage, the domestication of animals. The last of these mythic rulers is said to have introduced writing, pottery, and the calendar, the very inventions which indeed mark out the Longshan culture from earlier settlements. In claiming that humans began as parasites or worms on the body of the creator Pan Gu, there may be an element of early human self-criticism too. After the 5 emperors come the dynasties that are considered the beginning of historic China: the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. In the almost 2,000 years they cover, we have the names of kings, increasingly complicated and beautiful artifacts, evidence of cities, temples, and fortresses, and writing that is clearly the predecessor of modern Chinese. In short, we have China. Right at the beginning of this, however, we are still in the dim and misty place where there is more myth than evidence. Of around 300 BC, the Shangshu, or Book of History, is the first written text about what is called China's first dynasty, the Xia. The same account talks of 10,000 states coexisting at the same time, so clearly the Xia were hardly China-straddling. Archaeology suggests numerous rival chiefdoms. The Xia are said to have been founded in 2205 BC by our remarkable tamer of rivers and floods, Da Yu. All early Chinese history is the history of dynasties, one succeeding another like the succession of kings and queens that British schoolchildren once memorized. Even if he was plucked from half-remembered oral traditions by later writers keen to proclaim one China, Da Yu is in at the start of all this. He was supposed to have divided central China into a neat series of parallel box-like zones. The centre of the 9 zhou, or provinces, was the province of the king, leading eventually to a zone for foreigners, and then to the wilderness beyond, all of which sounds like the Chinese version of the Middle Kingdom, and therefore suspiciously like propaganda. So did the Xia kings even exist? Never mind Da Yu himself. Until recently, the general view was that this was an entirely mythic story, with, after all, a gap of almost 2,000 years before it was written down. But the discovery of what seems to be a Longshan culture capital city at Erlitou has changed minds. The Xia may not have been a big dynasty, but they probably did exist on the banks of the Yellow River and emerged from the Longshan culture itself. Erlitou, discovered in 1959 in Henan province, has produced examples of beautiful bronze-cast wine vessels, or juets, which have the spindly delicacy of modernist designs. The city was centred on a large palace complex of rammed-down earth walls, a way of building that was very labour-intensive but produced rock-hard structures which still exist across China. Chinese archaeology is very exciting just now, because so much remains to be discovered. Recent excavations of tombs have found beautiful vases, jade ornaments, bronze weapons, very early writing, evidence of the cultivation of silk and the worship of ancestors. Unlike Çatalhöyük, this was a hierarchical civilization run by kings, or priest-kings, and able to mobilize large numbers of workers. We know that Chinese farming was heavily based on the rich alluvial plains of the Yellow River and its tributaries. In this, the early growth of human settlement was no different here than around the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, or the Indus, all of which produce cities, kings, and complex religions. Rivers make rich soil, but they also bring danger. As we have seen, they flood, and their waters need to be unravelled and spread about for maximum farming success. As much as wild plants or wild animals, they need to be tamed. But the necessary work calls for leadership and organisation, which in turn means hierarchy and rulers. Farming villages do not need to combine in large numbers simply to grow crops or tend animals, but they do if they want to divert rivers, create networks of irrigation channels and flood protection systems. The role of civil engineering in human history is often overlooked. So Da Yu's story is a kind of explanation for the growth of political authority. He becomes king of the Xia because he has earned it by organizing the people for their own good. It is hardly a radical proposition that, in general, kings and emperors bring oppression. They may start small with labour gangs building dikes, but they progress to fortress walls and armies and tax collectors. The underlying message of the Da Yu tale is that this imposition of authority is still better than disorder. In this case, the chaos unleashed by rivers that change their direction or floods that wipe away the livelihoods of millions. In other words, rulers are better than the alternative. It is a message that would have pharaohs and Babylonian priests nodding in agreement. But the fact that the story of Da Yu and then the ups and downs of the dynasties that followed the Xia were written down and made part of a national narrative matters almost as much. Authority imposed early on because of the need to mobilize the masses to control nature is then passed down generation by generation. And as in the West, the Chinese rulers claim their authority not simply because they are good at organizing or able to scare their subjects, but because they have a special link with the gods. They can have a quiet word and help end the famine or stop the rains. So the great leaps forward in Chinese art and technology are closely related to religious rites. Ever more ingeniously cast and elaborately carved bronze vessels, musical instruments and animal bones, baked then broken to read the future, turn up in Chinese archaeological sites. Great squat tripods and bronze drinking vessels, whose sides are as mazed and rippled as coral reefs, may seem strange things for early cultures to invest so much energy in. In fact, they are ruthlessly political. They are about power. Nile Nightmares. Ancient Egypt, our third river civilization, often seems a culture to gape at, not to love. It touches the modern world hardly at all. Sphinxes and pyramids have become globalized visual kitsch. Museum audiences queue around the world to stare at gold or painted relics. Cultural tourists descend by the planeload to see the temples and funeral complex of the Valley of the Kings. But for such a long-lasting and successful culture, the Egyptians have left relatively few marks on later ways of thinking. The religion of Horus and Osiris enjoyed a brief revival of interest during the 20th century among occult dabblers and circus tent crooks. Pharaonic mysteries have briefly enthused the makers of movie mystery capers. But compared with the deep influence of Judaism and its later developments, or the power of Greek thought or Roman politics, or even across Asia the continuing influence of early Chinese and Indian thinkers, ancient Egypt has little left alive. The Mesopotamian stumpy relics of powdered brick are pathetic compared with the physical remains of the Egyptians, but they produced more in the way of science, mathematics, and technology to pass on than the creators of this great death cult on the edge of the desert. Egyptologists, not to mention Egyptians, would say that this impression is ignorant and unfair. The people of ancient Egypt were formidable artists and builders, and they developed a complex religion sustaining them for millennia. Many humbler grave sites than those of the rulers show evidence of a colourful culture that had more respect for women than had its rivals, and whose people loved life, revelling in the natural world, enjoying beer, food, sex, and gossip. Their obsession with the afterlife came about because they liked this one so much, believing that with proper preparation they could have more of the same. And yet we are left with those forbidding bird or dog-headed deities, the scarabs and the blank stares of super-kings whose vast monuments still insist on awe, but nothing more. Why is this? The culture's lack of portability through time and space seems to be linked with its relative absence of physical movement in its own time. It was just remarkably self-sufficient. Ancient Egypt proper lasted for more than 3,000 years, from the pre-dynastic kingdoms to the final disappearance of the Greek pharaohs in Roman times. Very early art from the Nile has an earthy directness that sets it apart. Some of the simple clay models of farmers and animals are similar to the attractive human early art of Mesoamerican people. But quite soon an Egyptian style becomes fixed and hardened, and although a practised eye can distinguish between dynasties and even reigns, it barely evolves for 2 millennia. There is a well-made sculpture of a king, Khafre, from 2675 BC, which would not look out of place among those of his successors 1,500 years later. In the great temple of Luxor is a little inner temple built to celebrate Alexander the Great being declared pharaoh in 332 BC. The artwork on one wall faces images from the early so-called New Kingdom of more than 1,000 years before, and the two look very similar, though there has been a certain falling off in subtlety. One obvious reason is that for the ancient Egyptians there was no art for art's sake. Art was an expression of religion and of earthly power. Its job was to describe the hidden world of powerful gods, to record man's relationship with them, and to intimidate travellers or rebels through the power of its kings. This required an art of repetition, and sometimes gigantism, not of humanism or realism. The culprit is also the hero of the Egyptian story, the Nile. The world's longest river, it is unusual in flowing from south to north. Since its prevailing winds blow from north to south, people with simple sailboats found it an excellent two-way conveyor belt. Better still, it not only provided its people with ample fish and wildfowl, but, before Nasser's Aswan Dam in modern times, it flooded regularly every year, bringing fresh water and silt to produce remarkably rich soil. The floods were not entirely regular. If they came late or too early, or if they were too strong or too weak, they could disrupt the planting and cause hunger. Ancient Egyptian history is marked by periodic disruptions, revolts, and fallings back, and these seem to have to do with times when the flooding Nile misbehaved. Yet, compared with the civilizations on the Tigris, Euphrates, Yellow River, and the Indus in today's Pakistan, the Egyptians were blessed. Not only did they enjoy a 4,000-mile streak of remarkable fecundity, culminating in a great floodplain delta on the shores of the Mediterranean, but they were also well protected by deserts and mountains to east and west, and by a relatively unpopulated African hinterland in the south. Egypt was invaded by Libyans and Persians and the mysterious Sea Peoples, but this happened relatively rarely. The flatter plains of Mesopotamia or the land highway of Palestine were much easier prey for armies of chariots and horsemen. Egypt was a hard place to attack, and almost impossible to hold for long, and so, in the ancient world, it always recovered. The Nile had a political effect, too. Though we speak of Egypt, there were really two Egypts. The two-way transit system knitted together people along a huge expanse, bringing black African Nubians and Mediterranean dwellers together in a single state. We cannot get a full sense of how ancient Egyptians saw their geography without understanding that for most of the time Upper Egypt, the more African south, dominated Lower Egypt, the more Mediterranean north. Egyptians today are still quick to note the difference, marked in the shape and colour of bodies. Egypt was a late starter compared with the Mesopotamians, partly because the land around it stayed so rich in plants and wildlife for so long that peoples were not forced to settle. Then the desert encroached further, and the first unifying kings arrived from the south, bearing wonderful names such as Narmer or baleful catfish. As with the story of Dayu and the Shah, only centralized royal power could have made a single nation of such a strung-out series of settlements. To use the river's bounty effectively, people here, too, needed a complex network of canals and irrigation systems, which had to be carefully cleaned, dug out and restored every year. So the habit of communal working, people's readiness to dig and build together, away from their fields, was set early on. This would later become very useful when it came to the pharaonic temples. The Egyptians believed the Nile flowed from the underworld. They spent a lot of time, quite reasonably, worrying about the annual flood. Nile gods featured early in their belief system, so when their kings associated themselves with the flow of the river, they acquired huge symbolic power. Geography isn't everything. Often in human history, the power of an individual or of an idea turns upside down what we might have expected from the position of rivers or the shape of a coastline. But if geographical determinism works anywhere, it works for this land, made by the Nile, protected by the Nile, serving the Nile's rulers, and eventually limited by the Nile. Of the monuments of ancient Egypt, few are as moving as Deir el-Medina, just round the mountainous corner from the Valley of the Kings, and across the river from Luxor. All about are vast monuments. There is the awesome temple of Karnak at Thebes, then the intimidating one of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, which celebrates that pharaoh's military victories with a manic sense of scale that would leave any 20th century dictator jealously gaping. There are the colossi of Memnon, a pair of faceless monsters commemorating King Amenhotep III, and the stage-set remains of Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. All embody everything we have come to expect of the ancient Egyptians. All are intimidating places, impressive in a Nazi or Stalinist way. Deir el-Medina is very different. A grey maze of stone and mud-brick walls, now only a few feet high, looking rather like a very large sheep pen, or an abandoned village from Gallic Scotland, somehow lost in the baking desert hills. Above it, on higher ground and cut into the face of a reddish cliff, are numerous holes, some with tiny brick pyramids nearby. Compared to the other sites in the vicinity, Deir el-Medina has very few visitors. This, though, was where the craftsmen who worked for the priests and the pharaohs lived with their families. They were not slaves. They worked hard, often labouring underground as they struggled to finish a tomb before its patron died. They were paid in wheat, clothes, and honey-flavoured beer. They had the weekends off. An Egyptian week lasted 10 days, so the break was less frequent. They worked for 2 4-hour shifts and could call on the work of poorer peasants and slaves to make their lives easier. Organised under 2 overseers who lived in the village, they celebrated the death of a pharaoh because it meant more work for them in the years to come. They enjoyed feast days when there was drunkenness and the occasional orgy, and they passed down their skills from one generation to the next. The Egyptian skill in mummifying corpses, too, was the domain of these artisan workers. Most remarkably, they found time to build their own funeral temples to take them to the afterlife. The day job meant raising great structures and tunnelling deep into the rock to prepare a final resting place for the great ones of the new dynasty. But meanwhile, they were building their own versions, complete with small pyramids and beautiful painted chambers 20 or 30 feet below ground. Their surfaces, still astonishingly brightly coloured, celebrate the love of a man and wife, the families of the workmen, the surrounding natural world of waving corn, ducks, and monkeys, and food in plenty. Here ordinary people were buried, and remote from the grand come-and-get-me monuments that lured grave robbers to the pharaohs even in ancient times. Many of them rested untouched until excavations began in the modern era. This would be interesting enough. But these people also recorded many of their thoughts on small pieces of limestone, often the waste from all that digging, and on broken pieces of pot, and on papyrus. Written in simplified popular script, then thrown away 3,000 years ago, a lot of it has survived. These ostraca record popular stories, legal complaints, love poems, books of dreams, gossip, feuds, wise sayings, the angry disinheriting of children by a woman who feels they did not look after her well enough in her old age, laundry lists, problems with defective donkeys, and even a cure for piles: flour, goose fat, salt, honey, and green beans. Mix into a paste and apply to the backside for 4 days. One particular bad character, a foreman called Paneb, seems to have been constantly making murderous threats to other workers, stealing from royal tombs, harassing other women into making clothes for him, and having illicit sex with another man's wife, a lady called Tai, and other married women. He was eventually tried by the pharaoh's vizier and removed from his job, though we do not know what eventually happened to him. This may have been the result of a village feud, but it shows there was a trusted and effective system of justice at work. The story of this village is not only a refreshing and unusual instance of the voices of ordinary workers, skilled and valued people, but manual workers nevertheless, and their families emerging from distant history. It also shows that they shared the religious convictions of their rulers, and, as soon as it was possible, aspired to share their underworld too. Indeed, when we consider the lives of such people, proud of their skills as stonemasons, painters, carpenters, makers of clothing, and cooks, who ate reasonably well, mixing fish and meat with a basic diet of vegetables, bread, and beer, who had a rich spiritual life that made sense of their world, and who trusted in a system of fair law, the idea of a downtrodden, semi-enslaved world of ancient toilers falls away. Were the lives of these villagers not better in most ways than the lives of millions of poorer paid or unemployed people in tower blocks today? Back to the bull. The Minoans were the first European civilization, from around 3600 to 1160 BC. Though only just, since their island of Crete lies in the far south of the jagged Greek peninsula. They were trading and seafaring people whose pottery turns up in Egypt, and whose art was influenced by the Egyptians. They were literate, though their form of writing has never been deciphered. They seem to have been relatively unwarlike. Their art and architecture are instantly attractive, giving an initial impression of an airy, tranquil, female-dominated society whose palace walls ripple with dancing dolphins. Amid the fat red columns and excellent sewerage systems are images of a little bull dancing here, a moment of saffron gathering there. But the Minoans are particularly useful as a warning not from history, but about history, and how we romanticize it. The great Minoan palace of Knossos is one of the most popular tourism sites in the eastern Mediterranean, and has been for a century. Sightseers already half in love with this hot, rosemary-scented island idyll learn that it was destroyed in the aftermath of a terrible earthquake at Santorini. The words "lost civilization of Atlantis" are muttered. This is how many modern Europeans like to think of their earlier selves: peaceable, artistic, liberated, and romantically doomed, a story that is half Eden and half the Titanic. But it is almost all bull. Knossos is an old building, at least by our standards. It dates back to between 1905 and 1930 AD, and has been described by one archaeologist as one of the first reinforced concrete buildings ever erected on Crete, bearing unsettling echoes of Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square and the modernist architecture of Le Corbusier. Cathy Geer found it suited to the urban sprawl now encroaching on the site. Today, all of Greece is liberally studded with half-built, low-rise, skeletal modernist ruins, stairs climbing to nowhere. The dubious reconstruction of a Bronze Age palace, filled with faked-up pictures, was the lifetime achievement of a British archaeologist, Sir Arthur Evans. Knossos had been discovered by a local Greek antiquarian who had started to dig in the 1870s. But with an excellent classical education and wealthy from the family's paper mill business, Evans bought the entire site when Crete became independent of the Ottoman Empire. Like his friend, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, who had discovered, and accidentally partly destroyed, Troy in 1871, Evans saw himself as reconnecting the modern and ancient worlds, and cleansing the dirty industrial mess of modern Europe through the revived memory of simpler, nobler times. As Geer puts it, Evans was infused and animated by spiritual hunger, and he wanted nothing less than the pagan re-enchantment of the modern world. To achieve this, in his hunger, Evans first supported the ruined buildings he was excavating with wood and plaster, and then slowly began to improve them with the flexible and useful recent invention of reinforced concrete. The extent to which his reimagining of the Knossos complex is an accurate and reasonable guess, or merely a modernist fantasy, divides even the experts. Evans was searching for a pacific, sexually relaxed paradise, and in Crete, avoiding any evidence of military fortification. Later on, he commissioned modern artists to touch up ancient wall paintings so comprehensively that they produced new ones. The Swiss-French father and son team, both called Émile Gilliéron, produced reconstructions that go far beyond the evidence, yet are now reproduced around the world, and they probably went on to make full-scale fakes. The reconstructions include images of black African warriors used by the Minoans, according to Evans's fantasy, to invade the mainland Greeks, whom he associated with Germanic militarism. Shrewd observers noticed something odd. The English novelist Evelyn Waugh, visiting the Heraclean Museum where the paintings were on show, wrote of his suspicion that their painters have tempered their zeal for accurate reconstruction with a somewhat inappropriate predilection for the covers of Vogue. Even the name Minoan came from Evans's belief that he had discovered the original site of King Minos's famous labyrinth, where, according to classical myth, the hero Theseus killed the half-bull and half-man Minotaur. The myth placed King Minos on Crete, and had it that the Minotaur devoured fresh Athenian children. There is something sadistic about the story, and what the Minoans really called themselves, we cannot say. So from this rubble, what can we know for sure about the people we call Minoans? Their civilization lasted for around 1,300 years, and survived not one but a series of natural disasters, including a hugely destructive earthquake and 2 volcanic eruptions, and a tsunami, which devastated coastal settlements and their all-important shipping. Recent archaeology, influenced by the huge destructive power of the 2004 tsunami in Asia, suggests similar devastation in Crete. The Minoan palaces that scatter the island, linked by stone roads, are probably urban, religious and trading centres. They traded in tin, very well made and painted and unfaked pottery, as well as a wide range of foods, oils and other staples. Their agriculture was sophisticated, and it does seem that their religion was dominated by priestesses and by some form of bull worship. A game or ritual involving leaping over bulls, grasping them by their horns, which must have been far more dangerous than modern bullfighting, is seen on genuine images. Even if their art was not quite as sexily exuberant as that of the reconstructors, it was sinuous and immediately attractive. But there is a darker side to the culture. It is now thought that they did go to war, and did protect their citadels with defensive walls. At Anamospilia, a temple near Knossos, as stark and unadorned an excavation as the other is rebuilt and imagined, 3 skeletons were found by a Greek-led team in 1979. They had apparently all died in the immediate aftermath of the later volcanic eruption. One is thought to be of a 28-year-old priestess, and another of a priest. The third is the skeleton of an 18-year-old boy, tethered in a fetal position and with an ornate knife sticking through him. The arrangement of blackened and white bones suggests he was still bleeding to death when the final disaster struck, and the obvious conclusion is that he was a human sacrifice designed to appease the volcano. Far from being a society of peace and love, wafting about in gossamer garments and admiring the dolphins, the Minoans seem to have been as bloody as anyone else. Just as the first Cro-Magnons were able to combine beautiful art and cannibalism, so the first civilization in Europe combined beauty and human sacrifice. The hunter-gatherers had struggled with the natural challenges produced by an erratic and difficult climate. Their Minoan descendants were still struggling with natural threats big enough to overwhelm their way of life. In between, man had begun to learn how to reshape nature. But outside a few specially favoured river valleys, this remained a precarious and uncertain victory. The end of the Minoan story is messy. Most scholars now believe they were not wiped out by a single cataclysm, as the tourist guides say, but were sufficiently weakened by eruptions and earthquakes to make them relatively easy meat for invading Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. Certainly Greek speakers replaced the late Minoan elites not very long before their civilization too mysteriously disappeared. As we shall see later, the end of a lively and sophisticated Bronze Age Mediterranean world is one of history's more tantalizing puzzles. By this point, Eve's children have already laid the foundations of the modern world. Most of the spadework has been done over a span of 50,000 years by people whose names we will never know, and most of whose languages remain a mystery. They have cleared forests, invented agriculture, raised the first towns and cities, and advanced enough in learning to use mathematics and writing, preserving their names and stories. They have also begun to develop a class system and fighting elites. They have invented war. Part 2. The Case for War. The first great age of empire, from the Assyrians to Alexander, and how civil conflict produced radical advances in religion, writing, and philosophy. War, and more war. A dreary chronicle of swollen-headed butcher kings, charcoaled cities, and flies buzzing on silent flesh. It is true that the early Mediterranean, Indian, and Asian worlds saw almost incessant warfare, a great churning of empires and armies which, you might have thought, would push civilization back to a dark age. And indeed, around 3,000 years ago there was a dark age, a mysterious collapse across what had been a cradle of civilization. Everywhere archaeologists report depopulation, palaces abandoned, and the widespread loss of skills, including writing. But out of the disaster arose new empires, now with iron weapons, about to write down their own history and chronicle their own wars. And however terrible war may be, the awkward truth is that war has been a huge driver of change in human history. When we reach into a purse or pocket for coins, when we argue about dangerous extremists in our democracies, or about the mingling of cultures, when we write our thoughts down using the alphabet or read headlines about threats to the traditional family, we are using tools and thoughts given to us by this apparently remote age of empires, thinkers, and warrior kings. So here, from Greece to India and China, is the case for war. Greek glory and the First Empires. Murderous, doomed, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion feasts for the dogs and birds. Homer, Iliad. Into written history strides a story we still read today. It begins in the middle of a war, with the rage of the warrior Achilles, and it comprises just 2 weeks' worth of bickering, sand, heat, and very bloody death in front of the walls of a city. The action takes place near the end of a decade-long siege, a pointless stalemate. This is the Iliad of Homer. With that, and his other great poem of journeying and heartache, the Odyssey, Homer began to make Greece. For the classical Greeks, these books were the Bible and Shakespeare combined, a source of cultural identity, a vast storehouse of expressions, and a treasury for orators. Educated Greeks of the 5th century BC prided themselves on knowing these huge poems by heart. Since then, Homer's tales and the surrounding myths of Helen's abduction and the Trojan horse have dug their way into the world's imagination, their influence extending from Roman generals to the poets of Shakespeare's England and modern filmmakers. Here is one place where a true world culture begins, and it is the earliest known work of Western literature. Not only is the Iliad a war story, but it is an unusually convincing one, about an army whose leaders are petty and sometimes mutinous, where disease stalks the camp, and wounds are frightful, and the enemy is to be admired, not merely hated, and in which the good guys die. It glories in violence, this poem, yet it was written by someone who found the human lust for war silly and bitter. He was deeply conflicted about conflict, and thus a deathless poet of the human condition. These are the centuries when mankind's core civilizations moved from bronze weapons to iron ones, and from oral tales to stories written down. The role of war as a dark driver of change is unavoidable. Advances in metal working, wheels, horsemanship, sailing, mathematics and counting, architecture and religion are driven by confrontation in China, India, and the Mediterranean. This is obviously an ambiguous story. Greece is a good place to start it, both because of what will happen there and what had happened just before the Iron Age, when we get a tantalizing glimpse of a better future that would be snuffed out. Across the Mycenaean Greek world of Homer's heroes, a dark shadow would soon fall, scattering the people, destroying the palaces and cities, until even the ability to write was lost. The Greeks who followed, using Homer to recall their identity, blamed war for their predicament. We do not know quite what happened. Around 1000 BC, some great disaster, or string of disasters, hit the eastern Mediterranean, causing a dramatic depopulation. If the Greeks coming later, in early classical times, thought this was somehow connected with the Trojan conflict, then perhaps war was part of the story. Historians think invasions of Dorian tribes from the north, coming upon Greek statelets weakened by local conflicts, and wiping them out, may have been responsible. Alternatively, this collapse might have been driven by natural disasters, climate change, or a series of terrible earthquakes provoking local wars of mere survival. One single cause seems unlikely. We do know that before this great and mysterious disaster, the Bronze Age world of the Mediterranean was booming. Excavations and written inscriptions are filling in some of our knowledge. Few finds have been as outstanding as that of a merchant ship cruising off the Turkish coast a century or so before the Trojan War. It was discovered by a local diver and then recovered by underwater archaeologists during 1984 to 94. Known as the Uluburun shipwreck, the boat has been dated, from the analysis of firewood it carried, to around 1310 BC. Built of cedar and oak from Lebanon, it was probably travelling from Cyprus or Palestine, perhaps to Rhodes or to the Hittite Empire, when it suddenly went down close to shore. Bones from the meal the sailors were eating when it happened have been recovered. More amazing, though, was its cargo. There was a huge haul of carefully made copper ingots from the mines on Cyprus, shaped to be easily carried on pack-animal saddles, and tin ingots, too, for the manufacture of the bronze used for armour, weapons, and tools. There were sacks of cobalt, turquoise, and lavender-coloured glass, many musical instruments, jars of beads, olives and dye from Canaan, hard black wood from Africa, exquisite gold jewellery from Egypt, elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth, ostrich egg shells and turtle shells, swords from Italy, Palestine and Greece, as well as other weapons thought to have come from Bulgaria and the Alps. The many tools included axes, drill bits, tongs and saws. There was food, too, including pine nuts, figs, coriander, almonds and pomegranates, as well as amber from the Baltic, the seal of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, and even 2 writing books made of boxwood, ivory and beeswax, with a stylus for writing, a kind of notebook described by Homer. This was the find from just one ship, quite small and miraculously preserved for 3,300 years. Its hold was like a knot with threads reaching out to Italy and the Balkans, sub-Saharan Africa, the Baltic, the Assyrian world, Mycenae, and Egypt. It is vivid evidence of the relative wealth, sophistication, and cosmopolitan culture that disappeared. The chance discovery of a single boat overturned many old ideas about the Bronze Age and makes one wonder about the civilizations that might have emerged out of centuries of commercial rivalry rather than military confrontation. It was not to be. In the Iron Age, war, rather than trade, would be the repeated trigger for change. The wars, dimly remembered by Homer's listeners, would eventually give way to a time of conflict that gave today's human civilizations the alphabets of the West, the sophisticated writing of the East, the great philosophies of classical Greece and Confucian China, architectural styles we still use, and religious ideas that inspire billions of modern people. Democracy was an idea forced on phalanxes of fighting men, all on the same level, protecting one another against richer men on horses. Monotheism emerged from the brutal invasion and enslavement of a small tribal people caught between empires. Chinese ideas about order and duty came only after the hideous experience of interminable disorder between states. By contrast, the cultures least directly affected by the pressures of war or invasion, like that of Egypt, changed least and gave less back to the common human story. So we have to ask, would a peaceful Mediterranean, trading raw materials and luxuries, but mainly tending goats and fishing, have produced a Sophocles or a Pericles? Few collective human experiences are as bad as war, with its train of rape, starvation, mutilation, and physical destruction. Yet war brings change, including sometimes change for the better. Uncertainty about war is knotted through Homer's poetry. His Greek and Trojan heroes are larger than life, young, magnificent animals, brimmingly alive. Looking back to the age of heroes, many of his listeners believe that the Greeks who landed on the sandy shore of the Troad had literally been giants. The bones of prehistoric beasts were claimed as relics of dead superheroes, whose doings interrupted the never-ending afternoon tea of the gods on Olympus. Yet Homer shows these men as all too human, when they sulk, bitch, boast, and have petty quarrels about status. And in the end, when they die, they go not to a glorious southern Valhalla, or to be comforted by teams of virgins, but fade away into a grim spectral underworld and pithless semi-existence. To understand this brilliant combination of excitement and grief-stricken wisdom, we need to remember Homer's audience and what had happened to the Greeks of his own time, who lived between the Bronze Age heroics of Mycenae and the beginnings of the classical Greece of city-states. About Homer himself we know next to nothing. He was said to have been blind. Some scholars think he did not even exist, that Homer is a neat shorthand for an anonymous group or tradition of storytellers, though others rebut them by pointing to the crafty shaping and coherence of the poems. Whoever he was, or they were, and I will use the singular for simplicity, Homer used a particular dialect of Greek called Ionic, from what is now the western coast of Turkey, where Troy stands too. Building on hints embedded in the poems, historians now think he lived around 750 BC, which is some 500 years after the war he purports to describe. Yet there are parts of the Iliad that seem much older, above all the famous Catalogue of the Ships, which lists the city-states and the peoples making up the Greek force, and which describes a Bronze Age political world, not one from Homer's time. Homer could have written the poems rather than compose them in his head to be spoken, since around 50 years earlier the Greeks had begun to use an adapted alphabet to note down their own words. Troy was real. The series of ancient settlements and fortresses uncovered first by the already mentioned German adventurer Heinrich Schliemann in 1871-3 match the geography and setting of the siege that Homer describes. Unfortunately, as an inexperienced archaeologist, Schliemann dug so deeply and so quickly he probably destroyed most of the Trojan city, which formed one of the layers of excavations, and there are still arguments about exactly which. Walls made of big limestone blocks protected Troy 6 of around 1350 BC, though, and it had 7-metre-high towers, a grand inner citadel, and a deep well. The site's amazing gold treasures, including what Schliemann thought was the crown of Helen of Troy, date from much earlier. But this was certainly a powerful, important place, perfectly situated for trade and for extorting tribute from passing ships. Troy, or Ilium, was a city of the Hittite world, under the protection of the great empire that ruled all of Anatolia. The Hittites themselves, early users of iron and chariot imperialists, have only recently, after major archaeological finds, fully reappeared in history. Troy, to them, was a vassal state on the extreme western edge of their world. They were literate. Hittite tablets, mainly diplomatic, and other records, unearthed at their capital city of Hattusa, make clear that Troy was part of a wealthy, complicated network of military and trading links. The Hittites called it Wilusa. We also know about the Greeks who besieged Troy, because they have left towns, and they too were literate, using a primitive script called Linear B. They are often known as the Mycenaeans, after Mycenae, the impressive citadel with lion-decorated gates that Homer tells us was King Agamemnon's capital. It was one of these early Greeks' main fortified bases, though recent scholarship suggests Thebes may have been at least as important. The Greeks? They had swept down into the valleys and islands named after them around 500 years before the Trojan conflict. They were warriors based on a clan system who built defensive hilltop forts across the mainland. They swiftly became effective sailors and raiders and would help to destroy the Minoans. The Mycenaean Greeks seized defeated people as slaves, and were probably some of the mysterious sea peoples who so terrified ancient Egyptians. They developed colonies and traded. Their pottery turns up across the eastern Mediterranean. Hittite records treat them as a single people and complain about their poor behaviour, including the transportation of 7,000 people from Anatolia to Mycenae. Greek records there also refer to lists of loot and slaves. 21 women from Cnidus, with their 12 girls and 10 boys, captives. Women of Miletus. Tauroja, women of Troy. Did a great alliance of Mycenae-era Greeks go to war with the Trojans? It is likely. Troy was close and rich. Historians today suggest it was a war over trade levies, rather than the abduction of a beautiful Spartan queen called Helen. Yet women had high status, and were often taken captive in Bronze Age fighting, and there was a Helen cult in Sparta well into classical times, so that part of the story might have some distant factual basis. Sadly, only a couple of generations after the war Homer describes, that great black curtain fell across the Mediterranean world. The palaces are abandoned. The superb gold-working skills of the Mycenaean Greeks disappear. Written words vanish. Homer's first audience was a migrant and impoverished one, a scattering of refugees remembering the good old days and asking repeatedly, what went wrong? The Iliad was part of a longer cycle of at least 6 epic poems, which have now been lost, telling of the origins of the war and how it ended, with the taking and destroying of Troy. Homer's 15,700-line poem could not have been recited or heard at one sitting. Perhaps it was meant for festivals of several days, or perhaps it was delivered like modern television dramas, in episodes. However it was heard, though, it demonstrates the great irony that war gives as well as taking away. No Trojan War, no Homer. No Homer, no, or at least much less, familiar classical Greek culture. For by the time these people re-emerge in history, reciting their tales of Achilles and Hector, Paris and Helen, they will be forming the most impressive civilization of ancient times. Concerning knowledge, be humble. And they will be doing it with a new invention, something simple, clever, and which shaped the Western world. It has no single inventor we know of, and appeared quite mysteriously among a people who have left the world little else. Concerning knowledge, here and now be humble, you yourself, in this basement. Thus the short, peppery order halfway down a tunnel leading to the tomb of a king. His sarcophagus was discovered in 1925 in the Lebanese port city of Byblos. King Ahiram is shown sitting on a throne, being offered a lotus flower by a priestess, just another day in the life of just another king. Around him are sphinxes. There is a longer inscription which seems to suggest a father and son burial, and warns, in rather obscure terms, against grave robbery. One should cancel his registration concerning the libation tube of the memorial sacrifice. Perhaps when it was carved this was a terrifying threat. Another translation suggests more directly that the son buried the father and is warning off anyone who digs him up. May the sceptre of his rule be torn away. May the throne of his kingdom be overturned. What makes Ahiram's sarcophagus remarkable, however, is not the art or the words, but how the words are written. For this is the earliest example known of the Phoenician alphabet, written in Byblos about 3,000 years ago. From this script of 22 stark letters, simple and memorable, all of them consonants, derived the writing of the ancient Greeks, and Aramaic, and the script of the Etruscans of Italy, and thus Latin, and every European language. Many scholars believe Indic and Brahmi scripts come from the Aramaic too, which would mean the Phoenicians' invention has covered almost every part of the world except China and the Far East. It is not quite a coincidence that Byblos gives us the word Bible. The city was a trading city for papyrus to write on, and the Greek word for papyrus became the name for book, hence Bible. Who were the Phoenicians? This is again a Greek name for the trading and coastal people originally from Canaan. Living around modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, they had been driven to the coast, probably by the relentlessly unpleasant Assyrian war machine, the great people-stirrers of the age. The coastal Canaanites were great shipbuilders and sailors, turning their ports of Tyre and Byblos, and later the great colony of Carthage, into hubs for Mediterranean trade. The old Egyptian word for a vessel that could venture out into deep sea was Byblos boat, and there were stories that by 600 BC the Phoenicians had sailed around Africa, a tall tale made more credible by the strange fact that they claimed they had eventually found the midday sun coming up on the right-hand side of their vessel. We know a little about their gods and what they looked like. They wore conical caps, simple cotton gowns, adored gold jewellery, and the men had combed, oiled beards. The women, according to carvings and inscriptions, seem to have had more power and freedom than was common in the ancient world. The most famous, though probably mythical Phoenician, was Dido of Tyre, also known as Elissa, who founded Carthage in 813 BC, after tricking the North African locals. They had said she could have as much land as she could fit into an ox hide, so she cut it into such a thin single strip that she had a sizable area for a settlement. Dido also fell in love with Aeneas, making his way from the Trojan disaster to Italy, and when he insisted on leaving her, killed herself on a funeral pyre. That, at any rate, is what the Romans said. The ox-hide story may refer to a Bronze Age view of the Phoenicians as wily double-crossers, the fate of traders throughout time. Later, the Phoenicians would be used by the Persians and even the Macedonians to provide ships from which their armies could fight. They were useful go-betweens, who needed, therefore, easy ways of keeping track of sales and bartering. Their alphabet used very simplified versions of hieroglyphs, pictures standing for the thing, and turned them into sounds, one sign for each sound. The names of their letters, such as Gimel, Dalet, Sin, came from the original images, here camel, door, tooth. They sound vaguely familiar even now. The Phoenician alphabet starts Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Daleth. The letters look odder to us, though a little more like Greek or Hebrew. Once the mark's correspondence with tongue and lip sounds was established, they could be arranged to mimic real speech. This may sound obvious, but it was a huge leap of logic. Once you knew the sounds of the letters, you could work out the sounds of words, and thus read messages without having to know the meaning of thousands of little drawings. The messages could be carved quite quickly because the alphabet was simple, and they could also be written on wax tablets, like the one discovered on the trading vessel. They were surely for commercial messages and record-keeping by busy traders with no time to waste. And, of course, the sounds could be used for different languages, just as German and Portuguese, for instance, are written with the same letters. So the Phoenician experiment could spread around the Mediterranean world and be quickly adapted. We believe the Greeks took it up by about 800 BC, just before Homer was at work, and they quickly improved it by adding vowel sounds. The Samaritans had their version, derived from a joint and even older script, and Hebrew writing came from that same source. So not only Homer, but the Bible too, pay tribute to these little-known people. Here is perhaps the greatest case in world history of an invention devised for humdrum purposes, traders' notations in a multilingual market, outstripping its origins and altering human life. In a similar way, the development of a U.S. military communication system into the World Wide Web is a parallel, but it is a smaller achievement than alphabetic writing. Poignantly, the Phoenicians themselves have left us very little writing of interest, some rather dull religious verses, lists, and cross-injunctions from long-dead kings. The Hebrew idea. The Hebrews would be rather marginal to world history, just another Middle Eastern people of somewhat obscure origins, were it not for their great idea, monotheism. They came to believe in a single universal God, who has a personal relationship with everyone who believes in him. This developed in written texts and was transmitted through writing, and it so outleaped its origins, detonating around the world like a series of mental explosions, that it has come to seem normal. Monotheism changed the world far more than any mere emperor, technology, or scientific discovery. Belief in a universal God who lives not in one particular temple, or by one gurgling stream, or atop a particular misty mountain, and who listens to the believer, seems to respond to a deep human need, even though, when the Hebrews developed the idea, it seemed very odd. Britain's chief rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, argues that the shift is from religions rooted in the world towards a source of meaning lying outside any world that can be seen or touched. The gods of polytheism, in all their buzzing, boisterous confusion, were within the universe. They were subject to nature. They did not create it. The Jewish God, by contrast, gave life meaning from outside, and also allowed a new politics of the covenant, of a people pledging themselves to one another and to the common good, a politics of we, the people. This new way of understanding would bind people together with a new intensity. Sadly, it would divide them with a fresh ferocity, too. Historians argue fiercely about how the Hebrew people discovered one godism. We do not even know quite where they themselves first came from. According to their tales, the man named as their original prophet, Abraham, who may really have existed, was born in Ur, that decaying imperial river city of baked brick terraces and Mesopotamian gods. The religion of the Mesopotamians has pre-echoes of Judaism. It is possible that the Jews did spend around 400 years in captivity in Egypt before breaking free under a leader with an Egyptian name, Moses, and trekking to the Promised Land, where they ousted local tribes and settled down. But there are no Egyptian records to show this, nor any archaeological evidence. and the Old Testament story seems to have been written down 7 centuries later. We do know that a people called Israel were living in the hills and valleys of present-day Israel around 1200 BC, thanks to a boastful inscription by the pharaoh Meneptah, listing the peoples of the area who have just been crushed. Among them, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. This probably means that the farmers' crops, rather than all the males, have been destroyed. Archaeologists find the culture of these people to be very similar to that of the coastal dwellers nearby in the land generally called Canaan. They had the same kinds of utensils, houses, and writing. More to the point, they seem to have had similar gods. The northern group of Hebrews did not call their god Yahweh, but El, which was the name of the chief god of the Canaanites. There were a dozen of these Hebrew tribes living in the area. Some might have arrived recently, but they probably originated in Arabia and had been a desert people pushing towards slightly more fertile land. The word Hebrew means someone from the other side of the Euphrates River, hence immigrant, or perhaps just wanderer. And from early on they distinguished themselves from their neighbours. To start with, the Hebrew God was not alone in his universe. El, as in Israel, was the father god, the Zeus of a divine family. His wife was Asherah. His children were the storm god Baal, who also brought fertility, and his sister Anat. Baal, in particular, continued to be worshipped for a long time as, slowly, the tribes of Israel began to differentiate themselves from their neighbours. Yahweh replaced El. The idea of God as a Greek-style being walking on the earth, speaking and intervening personally in human life, the bickering deities that we find in Homer following human affairs like football spectators, faded in favour of a more transcendent, obscure, and alarming presence. This took centuries, and is traced by scholars of the oldest parts of Jewish writing in what Christians now call the Old Testament. The strip of coastal land which is now Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon was as bitterly fought over in ancient times as it is today. Then it had the misfortune to find itself between the two great river peoples, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, including the Assyrians of the river Tigris. We have seen with the Phoenicians how trade can spur invention. The wider theme of this section, as noted earlier, is that war does too. And of this the Israelites are a prime example. Conflict pushed them on the next step to full-blown monotheism. Around 3,000 years ago, a kingdom was established with a royal house that included such famous figures as Saul, David, and Solomon. It had fought off another advanced coastal people, the Philistines. This kingdom is remembered as the high point of ancient independent Israel. There, an elite of teacher-preachers, the prophets, developed a new way of thinking about religion and ethics. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others spoke of justice and of the equality of men under the unchanging laws of a universal God, which were more important than the laws of kings or empires. By the 700s BC, however, the kingdom had broken into two: a northern state called Israel, with its capital city of Samaria, and a southern one, Judah, based at Jerusalem. At the time, a favoured byproduct of war was the deportation of defeated elites. Instead of simply being slaughtered, kings, teachers, craftsmen, and their families were carried off to the victor's city to work. This left the defeated territory leaderless, and in a sense, de-civilized. In 722 BC, this happened to the northern kingdom, effectively wiping out 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel and deporting around 25,000 people. The Assyrian Empire, with its huge capital at Nineveh, produced a series of hugely successful warrior kings who carved out most of the Middle East as their fiefdom through a mixture of intimidation and raw terror tactics. Their army was by far the most professional and well-equipped of the age, and their punishments for anyone who stood against them included decapitation, flaying alive, impaling, and deportation. We know the details of their brutal behaviour because they boasted about it on clay tablets and memorialized it with stone slab carvings. These managed to be both beautifully made and entirely horrible. War propaganda intended to intimidate visitors to Nineveh. 20 years after the fall of Israel, Judah rebelled against the Assyrians and faced another massive army. The city of Lachish was wiped out, and Jerusalem was saved only by huge bribes to the conquerors, and, perhaps, by an outbreak of disease among the besiegers. Then the high priest, Hilkiah, announced he had discovered a scroll of the laws given by Yahweh to Moses in a corner of the temple. Under the king Josiah, a fresh period of religious development began, based on written documents, as the priests were set the task of telling the complete story of the Jews. The tone was more aggressive, more strident. Idols of the old Canaanite gods, Baal and Astarte, were destroyed. Male prostitutes were expelled from the temple. But Judah was still a small, soft nut between the pincers of rival empires, and Josiah was defeated by the Egyptians not long before the next empire arrived. These conquerors were the formidable Babylonians, led by their king Nebuchadnezzar. There were 2 phases to their attack. In the first, the Jewish king and 10,000 of his people were taken into captivity. But this did not finish Judah off. There was a revolt, led in part by the prophet Jeremiah. The Babylonian army came back in 586 BC for a fearful siege of Jerusalem. After many months of being driven to starvation and perhaps even cannibalism, the inhabitants were overrun, and the city almost completely destroyed. A further 20,000 people were taken off, not to Nineveh this time, but to Babylon. The temple, where Yahweh had resided, was almost obliterated. The famous Babylonian exile, during which, by the waters, the captives lay down and wept, remembering Zion, had begun. For the people of Jerusalem, led east from their small, dusty city, Babylon must have been an awesome spectacle. It was one of the world's great centres, a melting pot of Middle Eastern peoples mingling under its huge gates, by its ziggurats, in its temples and hanging gardens. It was a glittering spectacle of blue and yellow-glazed tiles, statues of bulls and lions and dragons, and great processional roads. Here, sensible exiles would adapt and conform. The Jews, however, refused. Their scribes and priests consulted written scrolls and decided that Yahweh had not, after all, been destroyed with his temple. Instead, he had followed his people like a giant shadow and was with them in their exile. He was with them, however, for only so long as they observed purity laws, which had originally been just for the priests. They must keep themselves apart from heathens. Circumcision, refraining from pork, regular prayers, and a further refining of the holy texts all helped give the exiled Jews a stronger sense of group identity. They were in the melting pot, but they did not melt. The Jews were influenced by Babylon, of course. Biblical stories, including the flood, which echoes a famous Mesopotamian myth, and the multilingual building project of the Tower of Babel, are surely echoes of stories they picked up there. Meanwhile, the horror of what had happened to Jerusalem darkened the religion, bringing a stronger sense of divine wrath and final judgments. All this is central to the history of world religion. Under the influence of war and exile, the Hebrews evolved a notion of God which was based on written scripts, which treated all believers equally, while dividing them from the rest of unbelieving humanity, and which was mobile. Religion involved a text, an ideal of equality, and oneness in faith, and had a claim to universality. There had been other monotheistic cults and full religions, such as Persian Zoroastrianism, but there had been nothing remotely like this before. Later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam would follow this pattern. For the post-exile Jews, Yahweh had his temple with its empty room, its holy of holies, whence he would return and again be worshipped. But he was not, like other gods, rooted to one spot or one land. He did not need to communicate through a single holy place. Modern monotheism had arrived. The Babylonian captivity did not last so very long. After just 45 years, compared with the 400 of the fabled Egyptian exile, as soon as Persia's King Cyrus had defeated Babylon, he sent the Hebrews home. They carried with them something new. Cyrus, cross-dresser. One man, and one man alone, was responsible for the Jews returning to Judah, and thus for the development of their faith and the faiths of Christianity and Islam that grew from it. He is the only Gentile given the honorific title of Messiah. On a pillar at the dusty remnants of his once great capital of Pasargadae, in today's Iran, is carved what is believed to be his image. A bearded man with a bizarre crown and 4 wings stands dressed in a flowing gown. The inscription once above it read simply, "I, Cyrus the King, an Achaemenian." But he is clearly a cultural cross-dresser. His gown is one of those worn by the Elamites, a people dwelling in the highlands of southwestern Iran. His crown is an Egyptian one, but with Assyrian and Phoenician twists. His wings are Persian. What message is he trying to send? A rather wordier message from Cyrus helps us out. It comes on the side-drum-shaped clay Cyrus cylinder found at Babylon, and now in the British Museum in London. It was made after he had captured Babylon, peacefully, he insists, and released the Jews from exile. Like the winged relief, this is propaganda. It is how Cyrus II wanted to be seen. It begins with the conventional "look at me" top-dog rhetoric. I am Cyrus, king of the globe, great king, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of the land of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the earth. So far, so standard. But the next thing Cyrus wants us to know is that this champion of the god of the Jews also favours the Babylonians' god Marduk. And I sought daily to worship him. Along with freeing slaves and rebuilding houses, he had restored sanctuaries, and not only for Marduk, but for many other lesser gods across his new empire, beyond the Tigris River, whose sanctuaries had been in ruins over a long period. The gods whose abode is in the midst of them, I returned to their places and housed them in lasting abodes. The Greeks, who were fascinated by Cyrus and his descendants, believed that the Persians were simply more open than other people to foreign influences. There are suggestions that, because they were originally nomadic barbarians, they advanced in civilization by taking in and digesting the architecture, clothes, war technologies and gods of longer settled people. But history offers plenty of examples of barbarian invaders who simply burn, oppress, and move on. The Greeks were trying to understand one of the mysteries of Iron Age history. How it was that an obscure tribal people suddenly erupted across Asia and built and sustained the greatest empire yet known. However, unlike the Jews, the Greeks misunderstood Cyrus. Well aware that his Persians were a small minority taking power over many ancient and once powerful civilizations, Cyrus had found a new way of governing. Under him, so long as you did not rebel, you had freedom of worship and custom. This was the first multicultural empire. But that did not make it less warlike or ruthless in repressing its enemies. Cyrus II was almost constantly at war with someone, and though he built a famously lovely capital with huge, carefully planted gardens called Paradisa, hence our paradise, most accounts say he died as he had lived, fighting. The most colourful account says he was fighting a fierce tribe led by a female ruler called Tomiris in today's Kazakhstan. He had won one battle by tricking them into getting drunk on unfamiliar alcohol, but Tomyris had her revenge, leading her troops for a second attack in one of the fiercest fights of ancient times, after which Cyrus was decapitated. His body was returned to Pasargadae, where his impressively stark limestone tomb still stands. This story comes from the Father of History, also labelled the Father of Lies by later jealous rivals, Herodotus. He probably visited Babylon searching for information about his life's work, the history of the struggle between the Greeks and the Persians. A gripping writer and a great storyteller, Herodotus tried his best to get first-hand information, and certainly travelled widely in the ancient world, but he also had the fatal journalist's enthusiasm for a ripping yarn. He never even tried to be dryly factual. He lived in a world which was God-haunted, superstitious and credulous, even more so than ours, at a time of oracles and vengeful deities. He may not tell us what really happened, and he is famously useless on causation, but Herodotus does tell us what the people on the street and in the villages thought had happened and why. Herodotus says Cyrus was the grandson of the king of the Medes, Astyages, which is probably true. He also says that Grandpa Astyages had a dream in which his daughter made water in such enormous quantities that it filled his city and swamped the whole of Asia. This somewhat indecorous behaviour was interpreted to mean that there was trouble ahead. So Astyages married her off to a quiet, dull man called Cambyses. She became pregnant. Old Astyages had another dream, this time that a huge vine grew out of his daughter's vagina and spread across Asia. Dr. Freud being unavailable, the Magi interpreted this as meaning that Astyages' grandson would usurp the throne. So orders were given to have the baby boy taken away and killed. The servant could not face doing this, and passed the job to a poor herdsman and his wife, who brought the boy up as their own. When he was 10, Cyrus was playing a game called Kings in a village street with other boys, and his behaviour was so noble that the trick was suspected. The servant who had failed to kill off the baby was rewarded by having his own son casseroled and served up to him. On the advice of the Magi, Astyages spared Cyrus. Cyrus then led a revolt by Persian soldiers against the king, and though Astyages impaled the Magi for getting things so wrong, quite rightly, it has to be said, he was duly overthrown. Cyrus treated his murderous grandfather with great consideration, and allowed him to stay at court until he died. Though clearly a mixture of prurient gossip and traditional mythic storytelling, Herodotus's account points to a truth about the historical Cyrus, or at least how he was perceived in the markets and byways where the historian listened and took notes. Cyrus was a strange mix of the ruthless and the tolerant, who came from an old line of warrior rulers, and for whom both lineage and authority were problematical. As a fighter, he combined troops from different peoples, introducing tactical innovations from across Asia to win spectacular victories. One of the most famous was over King Croesus of Lydia, in what is today Western Turkey. The Lydians were well known to the Greeks. Herodotus says they invented gold and silver coinage. It was certainly reliable. In Lydia, the river that contained substantial amounts of ore still runs past the archaeological remains of a very early mint, where the metal was refined and the coin stamped. Lydian-style coins, whose great merit was that their weight, purity, and therefore value were accepted far beyond the small state itself, provided a monetary system imported by Cyrus into his empire. Currency became current in Asia thanks to Cyrus's war. Herodotus also says that Solon, who composed the first unified law system for classical Athens, visited Lydia and warned Croesus that he could not be called happy until he was dead, because one never knew what might happen next. When Croesus had been defeated by Cyrus and was waiting to be executed on a pyre of wood, he told the Persian king about Solon's words. Cyrus thought of his own case and relented, keeping Croesus as a prisoner and adviser. When he asked the defeated Lydian whether he had actively wanted war, Croesus replied with perhaps the most famous sentence Herodotus ever scratched down. "No one is fool enough to choose war instead of peace. In peace, sons bury their fathers, but in war, fathers bury their sons." Herodotus's interest in Persian culture, shared by other Greek writers, was practical and urgent. Had Cyrus and the great kings who followed him solved the problem of how to rule well? They had created an empire linked by fast straight roads and governed by local administrators or satraps. Their tolerance of local religious customs allowed them to rule without an oppressively large force, and they seemed remarkably open to other people's ideas. Their armies were huge and composed of many different peoples. Their main cities were impressive. Herodotus notes that the people kiss when they meet in the street, rather than speaking, and he admires the custom whereby even the king refrains from putting someone to death for a single offence. They abhor lies and debt. They never pollute rivers with urine or spittle, or even wash their hands in the water they use to drink. They have an interesting way of taking decisions. If any important decision is to be made, they discuss the question when they are drunk, and the following day the master of the house submits their decision for reconsideration when they are sober. If they still approve it, it is adopted. If not, it is abandoned. Conversely, any decision they make when they are sober is reconsidered afterwards when they are drunk. This system, too, has lasted. It is widely practised in the British democracy at Westminster. The Persians were clearly an impressive people, to be learned from as well as feared. The Greek Miracle. We last left the Greek world itself, scattered and emigrant, settlers amid the ruins of their first civilization, listening to Homeric tales of the age of heroes. Between about 800 and 550 BC, the Greek story was one of gradual revival, based on their distinctive communities called polis, singular polis, which we normally translate as city-state. These varied greatly in size. Athens was a rare example of a survival from the Bronze Age, which had lost her hegemony over the surrounding area, but regained it to become the largest of these city-states. Most examples of the polis tended to involve one easily defended high point, or acropolis, with a town around it, and then villages and agricultural land around that. Other rural Greeks remained in their ethnos, or clan. The earliest towns were hardly defended. Later, stone walls and fortified gates appeared to protect them not against Persians, but against other Greeks. Up to 9 in 10 ancient Greeks were farmers, working relatively poor soil and struggling with the early effects of deforestation. They relied on wood and charcoal for fuel, and timber for house beams and ships, but from early on, having hacked back the relatively sparse forests climbing the mountains of their archipelago, they had to import from the Black Sea and Asia. They ate little meat, keeping goats and sheep mainly for clothing and milk, and depended heavily on barley, wheat, olives, grapes, and figs. Beer drinkers, like the Egyptians, were regarded as rather odd. The Mediterranean diet was established early. The geography of Greece was crucial to the development of this civilization. Lots of sharp-ridged ranges running down to the sea created separate city-states, growing independent of one another, likely to experiment in different ways of running their affairs. These early states were not egalitarian, like the first Anatolian towns. Most had developed from semi-tribal groups, run by warrior aristocrats who owned most of the land and wealth. This continued even when the Greeks became more urban and republican in their government. As late as the Golden Age of Athens, the state was riven by deep class conflicts, wealthy nobles being resented by the rest. However, to simplify a much more complicated story, The aristocrats steadily lost political ground as urban life became more important. They lost out first to tyrants, an Asian word which really meant usurpers, taking over sole control of a state. Then they started to lose ground to group decisions made by ordinary citizens, often meeting as families or tribes. By the 7th to 6th century BC, the Greeks had a complicated religious pantheon comprising both the family of Olympian gods that had probably been brought down by the first Aryan invaders and local cults. They shared a language, though found it hard to understand some of the rival dialects. They were also divided by culture, the Greeks who lived on the Asian coast being richer and perhaps softer than the Western Greeks of the Peloponnese. The most important early development came about through their method of fighting. In the 7th century BC, the Greeks had mastered the skill of fighting on foot, in tightly organized phalanxes of soldiers, each carrying a large shield to protect the man to his left, and charging with spears, switching to swords for close fighting. From this, two things followed. First, it required general discipline and mutual trust, virtues developed in the polis. Second, it meant that anyone who could afford the basic equipment, a bronze helmet, greaves, shield and spear, was a useful fighter. This included small-time farmers, as well as craftsmen and tradesmen. The old dominance of small numbers of aristocratic cavalry, all set to protect their patch, was trumped by common men fighting together. The political implications hardly need to be spelled out. One historian says that without this development, nobody would have dared kill off their community's main fighting force, the nobility. Why did it happen? Greek terrain, with its narrow valleys and mountainous gorges, was not particularly suited to horse warfare, and certainly not to the fleets of chariots favoured in Asia. You could hardly even start a charge across Attica without instantly tumbling head over heels or losing your wheels. It was not a landscape made for emperors any more than is Switzerland or Afghanistan. Later, a similar extension of people power would emerge at sea as the Greek states developed navies of war galleys that needed to be rowed by disciplined and experienced men working in perfect unison. This time the recruits came from those too poor to kit themselves out as hoplite warriors on land, so a common feeling, stemming from a shared headquarters and familiar geography, was fortified by the act of fighting together, and soon by a common enemy. Solidarity started in warfare. Apart from religious ideas and languages, not to mention the Homeric stories, the Greeks shared an enthusiasm for athletics, prepared for naked in gymnasiums. All Greece games, contests in music and fighting as well as racing, were an early way of binding Greeks together. Since each city-state had a different calendar, including different start times for each year, the games became a crucial way of measuring dates and time spans. The names of the winners of every Olympic Games since, allegedly, 776 BC became their version of our numerical counting of 2012 or 1945. The gymnasia, where men went oiled and naked, produced a strong culture of homosexual admiration and love affairs between boys and older men. These are the early distinctive signs of Greek culture, but they emphatically did not lead to all these city-states developing a single answer to ruling and to the problem of power. Political competition turned the Greeks into historians and philosophers. One of the more extreme political systems, and a challenge to other states, was that of the Spartans. Though Phidon of Argos is supposed to have introduced the tactic of phalanx fighting around 670 BC, it did not become a Spartan obsession until they had been beaten in battle by the men of Argos. The Spartans were already a warrior people, who had subdued a semi-enslaved landscape of farmers and helots, or serfs, as well as subsidiary villages who produced the food that allowed them to concentrate on their overriding hobby and interest, war. The Spartans developed a state with pre-echoes of samurai Japan, or fascism, which self-consciously rejected the nurturing of the gentler arts being enjoyed in other Greek states. Babies, judged weak-looking, were left out to die. Boys and girls were separated at the age of 7. Boys were brought up in military-style training camps and later sent out to steal and kill food for themselves. Girls, too, were made to run and wrestle naked. Later on, any one of them might provide a wife to be shared by several Spartan citizen brothers. Spartans who fought and lost often killed themselves. The Spartans had 2 kings at any one time and a senior council of men aged 60 and over, who would put their proposals to all male meetings of citizens. Alongside this balance of powers constitution, which allowed the city-state to avoid tyranny while giving its fighters an equal say, the Spartans shunned modernization such as money, or walling their villages, and relied on their terrifyingly well-organized semi-permanent army. The result was a dominant military state, which made other Greek states nervous, but which could be engaged by them to topple tyrants or confront enemies. Sparta rose to its greatest fame when it led the federated Greeks against the Persians. When Cyrus defeated Croesus in 546 BC, it was the Spartans who sent a message ordering him to back off, and who 47 years later would rally the Western Greeks against Persia in the Ionian Revolt. And in the 25 years that followed, it was the Spartans above all who kept the epic fight going. Yet other Greeks, particularly the Athenians, laughed at the Spartans for their uncouth ways, seeing them as long-haired, unwashed, uncultured killers. Athens, Sparta's great rival, was also a slave state, which gave extensive voting and other rights to its male citizens. Its original tyranny had been toppled with Spartan help in 510 BC. 2 years later, Athens's ruler, Cleisthenes, proposed a radical new system of voting and representation, based on local parish or village-level elections, and on larger demes. The deme was a territorial division, which could be as large as a small town, and which would now replace the family name as the main badge of belonging. This was an important shift. Himself the grandson of an Athenian tyrant, Cleisthenes believed that the rivalry and power struggles between families had led inexorably to breakdown and tyranny. Only by ending the obsession with family, or gene, could order be restored. Crucially, his complex plan led to a single assembly of citizens, all men aged over 30, who would take the biggest decisions. This was too large to be practical, since there were around 25,000 such people, but these elected a council of 500, who ruled Athens day by day. The full assembly would meet too, generally around 6,000 Athenians, traipsing into the city most weeks to listen and vote. This was democracy in action, the one thing almost everyone knows about ancient Athens. It proved surprisingly robust because of its relative moderation. Instead of being executed, those who threatened the system could be ostracized, or sent packing after a vote, conducted with pieces of broken pottery, of the assembly. Many were allowed back from exile after doing their time. Democracy as a system survived in Athens for nearly 200 years, on and off, though it never caught on widely in the ancient world. To work, it demanded an educated citizenry, though only perhaps 1/10 of them could actually read, as well as people who had learned how to speak publicly, to reason, and to follow complicated arguments. This development of what we might call civil society was as important as the results of the voting. Athenian democracy did not include women, younger men, or slaves, however. As Athens developed her gorgeous architecture and sculpture, her theatre and music and philosophy, she relied on slaves just as much as unsmiling Sparta did. And as Athens came to depend ever more on her silver mines to buy the corn she could not grow herself, huge numbers of slave miners were imported. One account suggests 150,000 at one time. But slaves were used heavily on farms as well. The historian Xenophon refers to 20,000 absconding from Athenian farms during a Spartan invasion, and as paid craftsmen, including for the great public buildings. It has been estimated that for every free male Athenian citizen, there were 2 slaves. Without the slaves captured in wars, the Greek farmers could not possibly have spared the time to learn to speak and vote, or to serve as active citizens. Nor could the Greek aristocrats have enjoyed the wealth and leisure to study philosophy. Again, it was war that underpinned the Greek miracle, and rather more substantially than many of its admirers like to admit. The fighting against the armies of the Persians went on by land and sea. It had begun with the Ionian Revolt of 499 BC, a rebellion by Greeks in Asia against their masters, which ended in Persian victory. But then Cyrus's successor, Darius, taking over after an interlude dominated by less than great kings of kings, determined to punish Athens for supporting the rebels. The campaign began well for the Persians, who mopped up small Greek island states and destroyed the rebel polis of Etruria, before landing on Attica to make for Athens. There, at Marathon, in 490 BC, the Athenians won a surprising and remarkable victory. They were heavily outnumbered. Even modern historians accept that the Persian army was anything from twice to 10 times as large, and had both cavalry and archers, which the Athenians lacked. But these citizen soldiers did a most surprising thing. They charged the Persian enemy at the run, with a deliberately weak centre but strong wings, and rolled them up, producing a great slaughter. The robustly partisan Herodotus says the Greeks closed with the enemy all along the line, and fought in a way not to be forgotten. They were the first Greeks, so far as I know, to charge at a run, and the first who dared to look without flinching at Persian dress and the men who wore it, for until that day came, no Greek could hear even the word Persian without terror. The Persians got back to their ships and tried to sail round to Athens for another attack, but the Athenian army had beaten them to it. The story of this extraordinary run in armour back to the city is believed to have produced the 26-mile marathon race of modern times. Another legend has it that the Athenian courier, Phidippides, ran the 26 miles back to his city to tell them of the victory and stiffen their determination to resist, dying after he delivered the message. Unfortunately, there seems no historical evidence for this. After Darius's death and a 10-year hiatus, his son Xerxes mounted a much larger invasion, intended to finish the Greeks off. By now, the federation, led by Athens and Sparta, embraced more than 70 other Greek states, though even more were standing on the sidelines or supporting the enemy. Herodotus calculated the Persian army at 5.2 million men, a ludicrous figure, but it was certainly a huge force, brought across the Hellespont by rope bridge and barges, including special horse barges. Herodotus gives a vividly exciting account of the famous fight at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where King Leonidas and 300 Spartans, whom he had selected himself, all men in middle life and all fathers of living sons, held back the Persians for days, until they were betrayed and all died. Xerxes' army then poured down towards Attica, and the Athenians had to evacuate their city, which was burned behind them. Eventually, in the narrow straits of Salamis, the combined Greek fleet won a crucial victory over the Persians. 2 further major battles, at Plataea on land and Mycale by sea, were also Greek victories, ending the invasion. Historians have argued since that these fights were crucial to Western civilization because it relied so heavily for its development on the thought, art and politics of the Greeks, which would otherwise have been snuffed out by Persian despotism. Like other historic military turning points, the imbalance of forces was probably exaggerated, but these Greek victories were the prototype of the war to save civilization, a trope used by the Russians before Borodino, by the British in 1940, and by scores of other forces. The Greek victory did lead to a golden age for Athens, since rather oddly Sparta did not seize the leadership of Greece, that her achievement in battle suggested she deserved. The 80 years from around 450 BC embraced the rise of the great statesman Pericles, the writing of the first historians, including of course Herodotus, and the rebuilding of the Athenian Parthenon under the sculptor Phidias. Athenian drama had emerged exuberantly from its origins in the performance of sacred song, and, alongside the tragedies of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, flourished a riotous and very rude tradition of comedies, most of them now lost, which acted as a constant criticism and heckle of Athenian life. These performances became even more showy and expensive as rich Athenians competed to fund them, rather like later Roman emperors competed to show the best games. They were originally staged with full musical accompaniment for the chorus, the main players in exotic masks and intoning in rhythmic speech, bright, open-air celebrations of urban life at festivals attended by tens of thousands of people enjoying the food stalls, the wine, and the gossip. Having just the words of some of the dramas is a little like knowing the operas of Handel or Verdi only from their librettos. In a similar way, seeing the superbly crafted statues of Athenian heroes and gods in galleries in cool, white stone hardly reflects the vividly painted public presences they would originally have been. And above all, of course, towered the philosophers, arguing about the nature of reality, what might constitute the good life, and how best to organize human societies. This wealth and confidence came from the great conflict. It originated in decisive military victory over the Asian superpower of the day. The crackle of criticism and laughter came from democratic winners, sure enough of themselves to laugh at themselves. The intense search to understand the constitutions of the 158 Greek states studied by Aristotle, and the differences between Asian and Greek societies, as Herodotus sought to do, to understand the causes of civil war, as Thucydides tried to, or the nature of the good society, as Socrates and Plato attempted. All this curiosity was not idle, and certainly not simple. It was the rich fruit of war. Aborigines and Aryans. Among the forces in the Persian army marching under Xerxes towards the Spartans, Herodotus tells us, were a group dressed in cotton, armed with iron-tipped cane bows, and in chariots pulled by horses or wild asses. These were from India. The early history of that vast triangular protrusion from Eurasia is one of the most lively, still developing subjects of study. As described earlier, it is now thought that the world-changing migration out of Africa brought people to India much earlier than to the Mediterranean, Europe, or China. The indigenous forest dwellers of southern India still look more like the Aboriginal Australians and East Asian Islanders who were part of humanity's first southern march than like northern Aryan Indians who came much later. For almost as soon as the early history of India was opened up by British scholar explorers in the 19th century, it was assumed that India's great civilizations came from outside, rather than being cooked and shaped at home. And it is true that waves of migrants and conquerors from tribal Asian herders to Greeks, Persians and Mongols pushed their way into India through the northwest gap between the Himalayas and the sea. Each of them radically changed the subcontinent. The British were different only in that they, like the Portuguese and French, arrived by sea. Yet it may well be that India's earliest known civilization, the mysterious urban centre of the Indus Valley, or Mohenjo-Daro, was indeed homegrown. At the start of the new Indian Republic in 1947, one leading politician, Jaipal Singh, a representative of the tribal or forest people, claimed to speak for the ancient Indus Valley tradition, labelling other Indians newcomers. The whole history of my people is one of continuous exploitation by the non-Aboriginals of India. So what was this, perhaps, Aboriginal civilization? The baked brick cities of the Indus River plain had excellent water systems and plumbing. Writing that